Hey guys, Mr. Mini Painter here and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be heading back to Middle Earth as I have been painting the Gundabad Catapult Troll. What a massive unit that was. I'm going to show you how I painted it step by step, and I'm going to do so in two parts. So this is part one of the video where I'll show you how I painted the catapult itself and all the tiny goblins or trolls or whatever they are on top. And I'm going to show you some different techniques and just take out of this what you need, what you want, and I hope it helps in any way. At least this is my version of the Catapult Troll. So without any further ado, let's just start this video by painting the catapults. Alright, to start off with, I primed the model in a light gray primer. You can use any gray you have, but I chose a light gray as I'm going to be working with some spray paint over it. I want it to be kind of bright. So when you start with a black primer, for example, you tend to end up with darker tones. Now I'm using an airbrush to do the base layer. If you do not have any airbrush lying around, that's of course not a big problem. You can use a large brush and receive the exact same result. But the dry brush is so much quicker. And I'm trying to use it more and more. I'm not really feeling confident painting with it, but for base coats and some transitioning colors, I think it's a very useful tool. Now I'm covering the entire model with this coat, even though we're not going to be painting brown all over it. And I'm using a mixture of dried bark and Abaddon black to do so. Now once you're done, make sure to let that dry. And you should have something looking like this. And I'm covering that entire model with Agrax Earthshade to darken it down just a little bit more, create some shades here and there, make that wood grain really work. Don't really worry about the rest of the details, we're going to be doing those later on, and we can go over the brown. Now I'm dry brushing the entire wood model with Baneblade Brown. Make sure to wipe off most of the paint of your brush, wipe it off of a paper cloth or maybe some sprue you have lying around so you remove most of the paint. And just go over this until you've covered the entire model. There are a lot of tiny details in this catapult, so take your time and really make that work. Now we're going for an extreme highlight of rock art flesh, just here and there on the most worn out places. So basically mostly the top, the wooden boards that they're standing on. You can do a little bit on the bottom to give it a bit of an edge highlight. Now I'm going to work with some contrast paint, starting with Skeleton Horde, to just do some of those planks in a different color, because this is just an assembly of every piece of wood they had lying around, and I'm using those different tones, for example snakebite leather now, just pure from the pot, and go over some of those boards, just randomize it. It doesn't really matter, but it's fun to have some different color in there, some different details, if it's really a mess that they put together. I'm also using wildwood as a third color, and when doing these boards or planks or whatever, make sure to cover both top and bottom, of course, to get a consistency in the color that you're using. Now once this is done, we're going to do the metal parts, and for that I'm using Leadbelcher. There are a lot of metal plates, there are some wheels on the sides covered with metal, some tiny supports below the planks, some parts holding all the wood pieces together. So carefully pick those out, take your time and really search, because I think I missed one or two and had to do it afterwards. So then you have something like this, looking quite neat already. Now this may seem a bit bright because I'm using a large light, but for me the colors were perfect. I also used the lead belcher to paint the two weapons on the top of this catapult thing. I figured they were metal as well. Just give them a base coat and be very careful because they're fragile. And it's quite hard to hold this large thing, and it's not really something you can put on a brush stand or something like that, so you have to do it by hand. Next, all of the rope parts I'm repainting with gray cere, which is my base color before I started. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to be covering it with some contrast paint. That really is a quick way of painting these ropes. So I'm picking out all of these tiny ropes and I'm covering them with snakebite leather, and that really gives a beautiful instant result. Nice dark shades in the recesses and nice and bright ropey color on the surface. And that works for all of the rope on there. Now it's okay if some parts are a bit darker or brighter, but the overall result for me was this, and I was really satisfied with it. Next, with some Nuln Oil, I'm shading the metals. So the weapons and all those tiny plates and wheels and whatever we painted before. This is Gundabad machinery. This is dirty, this is used, this is worn, this is scrap metal, so make it old, make it dirty. And I'm going to do the same thing with some Agrax Earthshade just to dirty it up, add some rust effect, and that really helps for the overall look. Don't create any puddles, just the color is enough. Next, the piece of rock that's going to be flung all the way across the battlefields. This is fragile, so be careful when painting it. It's quite difficult to hold the entire thing or just the rock. I'm painting it with some Mechanicus Standard Grey as a base color. And we're starting from there. Now, beside this rock, there are many other rocks, and I did not glue that together yet because I thought it was easier to paint them separate, both for the catapult as for the rock. So I'm covering these with the same base layer. Now, once that's dry, we're going to cover it all with some Nuln Oil, and I went quite heavy on this. Really darkened that down, as we're going to be brightening it up later on, so you get some nice darks and highlights in there. Shade those rocks as well. Again, heavy, straight from the pot, just slap it on there. Then with some Ashen Grey, I'm adding some first highlights. Pick out those lines, some edges, some larger surfaces, focusing mainly on the top that would be catching the most light. And after you've done this initial layer, I'm taking some gray cere for an extreme highlight, focusing on the very edges, the sharp parts of this rock. With a tiny brush, just pick out some of those lines to add sharpness. Once you have added sharpness, I'm taking a dry brush and kind of going over it like this with an absolute minimum amount of paint, just to create that rocky edginess that's because the rock is not just one color, it's just many different types of gray. This really works for the rocks. As for the cloth, or the thing that's has the rock hanging in it, I'm using Mornfang Brown for some of those pieces of cloth. This has been sewn together also by scrap material, so I'm using different colors to add to that effect. So I'm doing both inside and outside for some of those pieces with Mornfang brown, and Castellan green for the other parts. That really works very nice together. Don't forget about the inside as well. Now after this, we're going to be washing this with Agrax Earthshade on the brown parts. Again, I went quite heavy on this, and also creating an edge between the two colors. It can be dark and shady. For the greens, I'm using Athonian Camo Shade. I'm doing the exact same thing. Create some heavy shades there, and we're going to brush them up later on. Now while we let this dry, I'm focusing on the silvery, shiny, edgy parts of the metal, and for that I'm using Stormhost Silver. And if you want to create some sharpness to these blades, as I'm doing here, first outline the very top and just pull your brush from the middle towards the edge to create some lines here and there. And that way you get some extra sharpness to pieces of metal. So outline it and then just pull some lines towards the sharpest edge, so to say. As you can see here, I'm using an old brush with some split hairs because they're very useful for these kind of things. And just put some paint on there and pull it towards that end. Then I'm highlighting the greens with Castellan Green and Averland Sunset in about a 50-50 mix. Or maybe it was 30 of the yellow and 70 of the green. And I'm building that up in several steps. In that second step, we're adding more Averland Sunset, and you can really start to see those highlights working. You can keep adding Averland Sunset until you're satisfied. For the brown, I'm doing the exact same thing with XV88. It's a nice natural second color as a highlight. Focus on those edges and leave those darker areas as they are. And all that's left for this piece of cloth is the thread that holds it together. And for that I'm using Ushabti Bone as a base color. And I'm going over it with some Seraphim Sepia to shade it down a little bit. Leave those darker areas around it just as they are, because they really add to the effect. Final step is gluing it all together, and in this case it's just the rocks, as we're going to be painting the goblins separately. So it's kind of a trick to get it in there just right, because it barely fits, but once it's in there it's got plenty of room, and the trick is to add the glue later and not mess up your model. So at some points I'm adding some glue to the rocks and gluing it to the base. You can reach it from the back as well and kind of wiggle it in there. I think there's just like one way that it really fits, so just find out for yourself, I guess. I had to move it around a couple of times just to get it right. I'm always struggling when assembling these larger models. Here we are. Next step, the goblins on top. There are 7 of them, and I've kind of assembled them halfway, so the guys holding this wheel are already glued together. There's this guy holding a mallet. Then the base coat for the skin is rock art flesh. Well, let's correct that. That's the coat I used. I'm not saying it's the only one. It gives a kind of pale goblin skin. Then with some Corvus black, I'm painting all the cloth. When I'm painting these guys, for this time actually, I'm doing just the base colors first and all the highlights and shades afterwards. There's just a few colors on these dudes, so I thought it was the easiest step. Of course, you can do it color by color, or finish the skin first if you want. This way you can let the previous part dry while continuing on the rest. The armor I painted with lead belcher. Now this can get an old and worn look, but for a base color we're just covering it with a solid coat of lead belcher. Then all of the armor is held by some straps, and those we are painting with Mournfang brown. I think it's a nice and bright detail because you could darken it by using dried bark, for example, or rhinox hide or something like that, but I wanted to have a tiny bright detail on them as well, as we're going to be darkening down the rest. Now there are some pieces of cloth around the legs, at some of them, and I'm using Doomble Brown to create some leathery, clothy look. In the next step we're going to do some washes. To start with the skin, Carroburg Crimson, to make a pinkish kind of look on the skin area. Now I went quite heavy in there because I'm going to be dry brushing that later on, but you can do a bit less if you want and save up some time on the dry brushing, so it's just up to you. I think it's nice to have some color details in there. I'll let that dry. As you can see, I'm doing all of the goblins at once because it's a repetitive job, and once you have your paint ready, why not do all of them? I'm using a dry brush and some palette witch flesh to get some extreme highlights in there on those very edges, so the top of the head, the tip of the ears, the nose, the chin. And when using a dry brush with practically no paint, you get beautiful results. You have to go over it like 10 times maybe, but it's better to do that than to have too much paint on your brush and actually painting it instead of dry brushing it. Then with a heavy coat of Nuln Oil, I'm painting all of the blacks. The blacks and the metals, to be exact. So the armor, also the cloth hanging below. And then with some Agarex Earthshade, I'm covering the browns. So the straps and those wraps around the legs. It's okay to go quite heavy on this because they are dirty. Now there is a tiny part of a hand fixed on the catapult itself. It's from one of the goblins holding here. So don't forget to paint that as well with the exact same color scheme. So rock art flesh, Carroburg Crimson, and some palette witch flesh highlights. We're then painting in the eyes with palette witch flesh as well. Give it some tiny detail there. If you're uncomfortable with painting the eyes, you may leave them because the Carroburg Crimson has added some shade and effects in there as well. But it's always quite nice if you succeed, right? Tiny pupil in there with Abaddon Black. The trick is to get them look the exact way you want to look them. You want them to see in a certain direction. That's the big trick. Then with Corvus Black we're painting some of those lost hairs on their head. Corvus Black is a nice matte black or a very dark gray. That really works for well, these orc hairs, they're dirty, they're dark. And then with some ashen gray, we're very subtly highlighting that. I don't want them to be too bright, because you can go further by using Administratum Gray if you want. With Stormhorse Silver, we're edge highlighting the armor, and I'm just focusing on those very tips, the edges, and afterwards I used a dry brush to kind of spread that effect around, so that I would have some scratches, some uneven surface. It makes it look a bit more worn. I'm edge highlighting the cloth on below with Dawnstone. And also that you can take a bit further by adding some gray sear or a brighter variant of gray. For this particular model holding the handle, I'm using Mornfang Brown to give some leather strap effect to this handle. The handle itself I painted with lead belcher and shaded with null oil, of course. And there is also one guy holding this mace with the skull on top. And also for that, the top part I'm painting with Mornfang Brown as well. Then some dried bark for the handle. I figured that would be wood. And then shade everything with a heavy layer of Agrax Earth shade. I wanted it to be dirty, dark, and you can go over it again with Mornfang Brown to pick out some tiny details there if you want. I'm doing the same with the strap below the skull. And then for the skull itself, I'm using Karak stone. Now once that's dry, I'm highlighting that with some Screaming Skull. And I used some Seraphim Sepia to create some shade effects. But do that once it's dry, please. Then some Rhinox hide I used on the mallet. Is it a mallet or a mallet? I'm not really sure. The hammer. Let's call it Tiny Thor's hammer. I figured it was a wooden tool, so some wood effect here and there. Mornfang Brown to edge highlight that. Give it some sharp edges and some wood grain effect. And you can do the same on the handle we painted before, the one holding the skull. But then use some Mornfang Brown, for example. Or Baneblade. Once done, it's time to assemble all of those guys onto the catapult. Glue them together. And we're done. And there's our finalized catapult with the goblins on top. This was an absolute delight to paint, and there is still a tremendous amount of work to be done because the troll will be next. Now, if you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. I'm also painting a lot of different games on my Patreon page, so make sure to check that out as well, which is much appreciated. For now, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video where I will be painting the Gundabad Troll.